Hello there. A group of vain, clueless European leaders who have not defended their own nations properly for decades got together over the weekend to virtue signal to each other on the international stage about defending Ukraine. When final push comes to final shove, there is no such thing as soft power. You've either got the hard power to defend yourself or you have not. And right now, most people would agree that the UK does not have the hard power it needs to defend itself and its international interests. You only have to look at the angst within the UK government over Donald Trump questioning why the US should continue to stump up the money to defend Europe and Ukraine to see that. And further, despite all the talk at that emergency summit in London at the weekend about we have reached a crossroads and Europe has woken up, Europe must do the heavy lifting, and we need a coalition of the willing with the UK in the lead, blah, blah, blah. Despite all that, we do not have leaders with a clear vision of what defending ourselves actually looks like. The first question is, why are the borders of Ukraine so critical to UK defence, but the borders of the UK itself must be left as wide open as possible to anyone with the whim to come and fleece us? Defending the UK means defending UK borders. And we have a decades-long extremely poor record on that front, don't we? The second question I would ask is, what is Starmer's vision for our defence of Ukraine that he has committed us and our money to in order, he says, to defend ourselves? And is this about our defence, or is it about using our troops in an offensive mode to fight for the greater global moral good, as viewed from an internationalist WEF and UN standpoint? Is Starmer looking to kick Russia out of all the gains it has made in Ukraine since 2014, including Crimea? Does Starmer think Ukraine should keep the Russian real estate it has captured? Or does he have a view on how much land Zelensky has to cede to Putin before peace can be established? Where do the red lines lie? At the end of the day, there will be a lot of European running around like headless chickens until they realise that Trump and Vance are probably right. And how do our European leaders intend on doing all of this without attracting some sort of asymmetrical response from Putin? Or is it all just more theatre, put a bit more money in, send Ukraine a few more missiles and let the carnage continue? Or are we indeed looking at attempting to force regime change in Russia? What is the aim here? And talk from Ursula von der Leyen about making Ukraine an uningestible steel porcupine for any invader begs the inevitable question. Which bits of Ukraine are we talking about? And does Zelensky agree? I would surmise that Zelensky will now want it all back. And other European leaders will eventually be pressuring him into handing whole swathes of his country over to the Russian Federation for the sake of peace. And more crucially, why is Starmer not saying we'll increase UK defence spending to first make the UK an uningestible steel porcupine for any attacker? That is the first duty of government, isn't it? How can we engage in virtue signalling hostilities overseas if our own country is as vulnerable to attack as it is right now? To bad players, both external and internal. But once again, the establishment uniparty system puts everyone else on the planet ahead of its own people. Now, apart from the NATO treaty, what obligations exactly does the US owe a group of other NATO members who have not put their hands deep enough in their own pockets to defend themselves and their interests? Get this. All that money that the UK, for example, has splurged about the globe using the excuse of gaining so-called soft power was only made affordable by debt accumulation and relying on the US to do the heavy defence lifting. Without that US support, we could not have afforded many billions of pounds evaporating abroad like water in a hot day in the desert. Or, if we had, our Navy, Army and Air Force would right now be just museum pieces, if they are not already. And the motto of the Royal Navy is Si vis pacem para bellum, Latin for, if you wish for peace, prepare for war. But when the Berlin Wall crumbled under the might of people power on the 9th of November 1989, instead of looking at this as a temporary victory of peace, our politicians proclaimed it was the total end of war and declared we had a huge cash pile called the peace dividend to be spent on all those flowery peace things like DEI and foreign aid. And successive governments splurged that so-called peace dividend as far up the wall as they could, in ever greater quantities. And now, when reality dawns, we have no hard power and no ready cash to buy any hard power. We are in a massive peace pit of debt. Not only that, our politicians turn the education of our children, those who could always end up being needed to defend our shores, they turn them over to the UK-hating, indoctrinating Marxists, while opening up our borders because they deemed there will never be another threat to our well-being ever again. Utter to the point that now we have a growing proportion of the populace that hates the very country they were born in, educated in, work in, or were given refuge in. Where are all the dedicated patriotic recruits for an armed forces expansion going to come from? In short, our political and civil service class has used this period of peace to ensure our country and its people will never ever again be prepared for war and never again be able to defend itself. We have relied on the US through the NATO umbrella to protect us for so long we no longer have a credible defence of our own or any idea of what it should look like. Except the last resort of our UK independent, and yes it is independent, nuclear deterrent. And the smaller our conventional forces get, the closer to a first resort weapon the nuclear deterrent becomes. Anyway, the UK government response is to cast about for ways to pay for an uplift of a couple of tenths of a % in GDP in defence spending. But with an economy looking set to dwindle in size in the coming years due to the tinkering of Rachel from accounts, or more accurately, Rachel from the complaints department, any small increase in the percentage GDP spend on defence would at best maintain the current amount spent in real terms as overall GDP shrinks. But no one seems to be talking about that probability. And then we have other people erroneously saying we must reduce government spending to free up money for defence, entirely missing the point that defence spending is government spending of taxpayers' dosh. The reality is that we need to determine what is really required to rearm the UK properly with both personnel and the materiel of war, then use what's left to run the country's various now bloated government departments, and pare those down until we only pay for what we really need as essential to our nation. Bye-bye DEI, bye-bye net zero. Now, the knee-jerk reaction of our politicians will be to try and avoid those hard choices. They will now be casting about for a cheap way out that emits a message of strength, a paper tiger, if you will. And that paper tiger is being engineered right now in the form of a joint European defence system, where the only thing being defended is Europe as a whole, not the individual states within it, nor their individual interests. Look at France. It has tentatively offered up its nuclear deterrent to cover Europe. That means, in the end, French defence policy will be overtaken by the needs of European defence and foreign policy. But who will pay for it? And Keir Starmer will no doubt throw our nuclear deterrent into the pot too, along with our hefty intelligence set up to boot. All in the hope that they can hurriedly build a large cohesive European defence at little or no extra cost. The economy of scale argument, an argument that will fall flat on its face when soldiers are sent to die. Because the commitment to sacrifice service personnel actually comes from the people. They need to believe the sacrifice of their youth is worth it. Just being told by politicians that it is going to happen is not enough in modern days. But who will end up paying for it all? And importantly, who will have the control over it? And even more importantly, how cohesive would it really be? And how could the UK defend its interests about the globe if the small armed forces we have today are not increased, but merely restructured to defend mainland Europe? Remember, the last time we defended mainland Europe, during the Cold War with the forerunner of the Russian Federation, the USSR, we had up to 80,000 UK personnel in the British Army on the Rhine, the BAOR, alone. 80,000. And that's without all the associated sea and air power we had in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force back then. What would our politicians give to have the modern day equivalent of all of that on tap today? Well, they haven't, because being wet woke socialists who hate their own country, they've dismantled the whole shebang. And I fear that if we do end up rebuilding our armed forces, it will just be an inverted DEI pyramid, with the undeserving at the top ordering our white working classes onto the battlefield to DIE. Finally, please like, subscribe and comment below, and check out our other channel, Tripe and Whatnot, link in the descriptions box below. And thank you for watching.